Okay, hello everybody. So as I mentioned, and as you all requested, I'm putting this little overview video together. So this is about what trauma is and essentially like the process of addressing it. Now, of course, like this is a really complex and in-depth topic, as we all know. So again, this is just going to be an overview of the primary phases and what it is, etc. Um, Obviously, like this, like the healing journey itself is a long process, so I'm not going to be able to get to everything in this particular video. But the goal for it is to very simply and clearly, without compromising on depth, show what trauma is, what the process of addressing it is primarily, and then a few practical things that can be implemented right away to really address some of the exhaustion and basically just get some momentum going. And these are all really simple foundational things that need to be in any healing protocol anyway. So it's not like too much of a in-depth thing to share it. So um, let's get into this. So how does trauma happen in the first place? This here is a diagram of what are known as the four quadrants. So this is the four quadrant model created by Ken Wilber, who's the founder of integral theory. And these four quadrants represent all the different areas that essentially everything in the universe can show up in. So I'll just give a brief overview here because it relates to um, trauma and sort of like the holistic domino line of things. So this upper left, we have the individual interior. So this is essentially the intangible parts of us, thoughts, emotions, memories, states of mind, perceptions, immediate sensations, as it says here. The pronoun here is I. This is subjective, so this is different to each person. It's not tangibly measurable. The lower left, we have the collective interior. So this is intersubjective. So this is the sharing of our interiors, shared values, meanings, language, relationships, cultural background. So basically, interpersonal dynamics. Here, the upper right, we have the individual exterior. So this is the material body, which is including the brain. So the difference here is like the brain, tangibly measurable. The mind is not tangibly measurable. You can measure dopamine levels in the brain, and the brain itself is kind of like a crumpled grapefruit, similar in size in general, but the mind is not tangibly measurable. So that's a distinction there. So anything you can see or touch or essentially observe scientifically in time and space, this is the individual exterior. And in the lower right, we have the interobjective area. So this is the collective exterior. So this is systems, networks, technology, government, and the natural environment, etc. So these are objectively measurable aspects of life that are not essentially part of us primarily. For example, like my thumb or your thumb is tangibly measurable. Our hormone levels, etc., but they are native to us. The collective exterior aspect of things are tangibly and objectively measurable, but like a train system or a highway or road or government building or a system, a computer system, etc. Those are tangibly measurable, but they're not part of us, etc. So that's a brief overview, but that's really important for a little explanation in a couple minutes. So I'll just get into this. So what is trauma in the first place? And what I'm going to read here is actually the opening paragraph of a PDF that some of you may already have, which is called the what is trauma and the future self exercise. So I'll just read this out. So what is trauma in the first place? Trauma is the embodied and remnant residue left over after a large stressful event and or an accumulation of small stressful events that are greater in intensity, load, volume than one's coping capacity at the time it happened and ability to handle. So that means metabolizing and eliminating after. And the residue remains until one is able to create a coherent narrative through what happened, even if it was awful, to the point where sense and meaning can be made out of it, in conjunction with a full forgiveness of self and other, without compromising healthy boundaries, of course, and a conscious rewiring of one's nervous system back to where it is not in a looped cycle of fight, flight, freeze, and I could actually put fawn in there as well. So fawn means submission, just what like just submitting to the stressful force. So maybe that's someone who feels like they're trapped in a abusive relationship, but they can't do any of those other three things. So they're just submitting to the will of the other in the hopes that that will stop the stress from happening. And the residue remains to the degree that one's perceptions and beliefs haven't evolved to where they're now able to create a coherent narrative through what happened, even if it was awful, to the point where sense and meaning can be made out of it in conjunction with a oh, just noticed I put that paragraph in twice. Anyway. Okay, all right. There we go. We're all human. We make mistakes. Okay, onwards. Yeah, the point is, it's an experience. Trauma is an experience that goes beyond someone's coping capacity, and as a result of it going beyond someone's coping capacity, they're not able to make they're not able to make sense of it. So they're not able to process it and metabolize it out psychologically, and then that remains embodied physiologically, which can result in a um, just overstressed nervous system, which usually starts off as anxious and uppity, and then it gets exhausted, and then can go into a full-on freeze state if there's just so much sensory overload in the system itself. And that's where people can start feeling just really, really numb and almost like they're locked out of life. And that's the system's attempt to stop extra input coming in because and adding to an already overloaded system because there's so much memory that needs to be processed already, and as a result it wants to shut the world out because it can't add more to the list. So trauma as an acronym stands for to reject an unpleasant memory aggressively. So like as Dr. Keith Witt says, trauma is a form of memory, and the memory still has a charge and an unpleasant electricity to it if it is unresolved, and it remains unresolved to the degree that one can't make a coherent narrative out of it. And the ego, if it can't do that, so it's like this happened to me and I just cannot understand how to make sense of it. To keep it close is almost too painful. So sometimes it will hold it at bay. And this isn't, I'm not saying this in a judgmental way because context matters. Like, for example, to actually bring it in and deal with it and process it in a particular moment may not be the most ideal thing to do. For example, if there's concern for physical safety or kids are involved, or to bring this up and deal with it would open up too much intensity, and then that would compromise my ability to be effective in caring for my children or dealing with what I have to deal with at the moment. So sometimes that can be a reason for it being held at bay and not brought in to be processed. But regardless of that, to the degree that it's held away and not resolved, means it will stay traumatic. And so the reject part is why Dr. Keithwit also says that trauma separates. So the memory, an aspect of one's life that's unresolved, hasn't been integrated and understood. So there's an aspect of one's narrative and their life story that, because it's currently painful, has not been brought into that whole narrative consciously. It's still being kind of tucked away like a dirty little secret in some cases, or it's being pushed away as a just something that's too overwhelming to deal with, or sometimes it's I can't integrate that because I feel like if I do admit to it, then I'm defining myself as the thing that happened, and that's a bit too much to process. So there can be many reasons why, but the main point is what, to the degree that it's held away and not processed, is the degree to which it remains unresolved. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the way that this relates to the four quadrants here is these four quadrants show different areas where the sort of root injury can be. People can have many different things that are going on. So they can be mental, emotional, they can be physiological, they can be like things with relationships, and they can be things with just environment, etc. But what we find when we look at things in the context of the four quadrants is we can establish essentially where the root injury occurred in terms of these quadrants. And that will vary depending on person to person and what their individual experience is. And so we will have like other stuff in the other quadrants, but what we'll be able to find out looking through this four quadrant lens is the kind of sort of holistic domino line of where the root injury occurred, and then what propped up in what order. So we'll now have the kind of holistic domino line, so we can distinguish between what's the root and what's an exacerbator. So a couple of examples. Let's say the root injury was down in the lower left as a child. Maybe the person had a really suboptimal dynamic with their parents and felt really abandoned or was abused and things like that. That was an injury here, the root injury here, and then that caused a suboptimal self-perception in the upper left here. So their personal thoughts, emotions, their memories of their childhood was I wasn't wanted or I wasn't loved, and so this creates anxious, depressive states depending on the moment. And then as the psyche controls the physical system, the upper right here, the individual exterior, the body, will start to mirror the internal, the person's internal state. And this could be seen as a simple one is just really sort of depressed posture, but then if it goes on long enough, then chemically it starts to be reflected in stress hormone and being in fight flight. So the sympathetic nervous system is too stimulated, the parasympathetic nervous system can't come online and rest and repair, so that means that the vagus nerve is not activated, and then you can have a cascade of things like the vagus nerve connects the brain to the gut, so digestion is now compromised and people aren't digesting their food, so they can have many different things from uh, fungal and parasite infections if it goes on long enough, bloating, cramps, just yeah, there's a whole bunch of things, and also with compromised digestion, then the liver doesn't have the sort of final line of detoxification because the liver detoxifies, but then it gets dumped out through the digestive tract in conjunction with urine and sweat. But yeah, so now we're seeing like a kind of cascade here of what can happen. And then based on all of this that's going on with the individual, then they can impact the uh, systems around them and their environment, and suboptimally interacting with the networks that they're part of. For example, in their work environment, they can start suboptimally impacting that. And also that impacts their work relationships, and then they can start having further sort of catastrophizing thoughts about who they are because this is going wrong as well. And now we start seeing that there's a whole, it just starts bouncing around everywhere. But that example started here, and it can go in the opposite direction as well. Like in the lower right, maybe like anarchy happens in a country, and like people for that may have been fine in all of these quadrants. Like we could use uh, a very recent example of Russia invading Ukraine. All of that catastrophe happened in this area, and now they're getting a cascade in all of these other quadrants, but the root injury was here. So the point I'm trying to make with this and just highlight is it's really important to establish where the root is, establish what the exacerbators are, and not to say that we ignore any of them, but it gives us a hierarchy of what to work with and when and in what order, primarily. And that's really important because if we don't know what the root is, even if we're addressing the things that are exacerbators, if we don't also address the root too, then we're not going to get a lasting result. And also, knowing these and how they all interact with each other in terms of the quadrants, we know to take care of all of them as opposed to just view one sort of perspective as the right one. So you could have someone who's only a psychotherapist and only dealing in the upper left, for example, but which, if that's where the root is, then they hit the nail on the head, but they may not have known it. Uh, but you could also have people that are just sort of somatic practitioners, so dealing with the body. So they're doing a lot of breath work and working with the nervous system and physiologically getting trauma out of the tissues. But if the root injury was in the interiors, then it's always going to revert back, even though you'll get some temporary relief. And if people aren't aware of these other quadrants and the approaches and modalities to heal injuries in each of these areas, then what you get is something called quadrant absolutism, where people are not actually able to see and include a comprehensive approach to someone's issue that gets them a lasting result. That's why it's so important to understand that. So just moving on to like what's the process of healing it. Now again, these are just really, really brief sort of summary notes of the phases. There's so much depth and complexity in each of these. So don't mistake the simplicity for sort of quickness of stuff. Like there's a lot of complexity and depth here. So, but even though it's not easy and there's a lot to do, the process is quite simple when you understand it. So, what's the process of healing it? And just to say, all these phases include and transcend the previous. So what that means is it's not like we do phase one and then we move on to phase two and then stop doing phase one, etc. So maintenance is a life practice. So all of the things in these different phases are going to be continued and practiced and refined just like any other skill for life. Maintenance is easier than building something, so the initial healing journey itself is going to be a lot harder than maintaining the peaceful, sort of healed place that one finds themselves in after enough consistency and effort of doing the work. But that's a key point as well. So these are tools for life. So phase one, this is essentially waking up. So these different ups are the sort of 5 areas that Ken Wilber defines that are critical for anyone if they want to experience really embodied wholeness. So waking up essentially means waking up to the transcendent truth of who we are as human beings. In relation to trauma, what this means is this is where trauma is it's accepted without judgment, but with the compassionate self-awareness and determination to effectively address it in a lasting way. In addition, it's also where the ego begins to learn it's not defined by what happened. And this is done through anchoring its self definition to one's primary truth, one's deep, wise, and soulful self. So, this is the recalibration of self perception. So, this is the upper left, as we talked about in the four quadrant diagram. And this is where the ego individuates its identity to that of one's deep, wise, and soulful self. Because some of you may have heard me give this example already, but the trauma essentially is like residue on the outside of the truth of who we are. So if you imagine a really beautiful sculpture, just glowing and gorgeous and wonderful form, but you just cake it and cover it with mud, even to the degree that there's so much mud on it you can't even see any of the beautiful form beneath it. The question of does it stop being a beautiful statue at its core comes in, and the answer to that is no. And the healing process for trauma is the same, because trauma is the residue on the outside of the truth of who we are. Problems come and suffering happens when an individual's ego is currently identified and defining itself by the residue on the outside, as opposed to the deep soulful self that is the inherent truth of all human beings. And when the ego is doing that, that's when one feels constricted, that's when one feels hopeless, that's when one feels like there's no way out. But so the first thing, primary foundation number one, is to recalibrate the ego's identity, self-perception, and what it's defining itself as. Because if it gets to the place where it can say, what happened is what happened. Yes, it was awful, but it is not the definition of who I am at the core. That then provides space to allow love and power to continue to flow and healing to happen. That's foundation number one. So this is done by a few different exercises, like the future self exercise. So this is also bringing in Paul Chek's four doctor model as well. This is where the definition of one's doctor happiness comes in. So what is one's dream life beyond the pain? If success was guaranteed, what would I want for myself and my life going forward? This gives a clear dream to anchor to, and gives one a reason to heal, and gives the physiology a reason to heal, something that's beyond the pain itself. This phase is also about accepting the trauma's presence, but bringing it in close so it can be integrated with love and compassionate self-awareness, so the current story that one has at the moment can be evolved. So as mentioned before about trauma to reject an unpleasant memory aggressively, the first part is allowing the presence of the trauma to be there, and the ego feeling safe to do that because it's not defined by what happened, but still knowing that that memory needs to be brought in, and needs to be the story within that memory needs to be evolved into one that is empowering, and one that allows for growth and resilience on the other side of it. So sometimes the hesitation to bring these in is because the current story is really upsetting and distressing. But once the ego has anchored to the truth of one's soulful self, it doesn't fear that anymore because it knows that the story and definition of the unpleasant memory at the moment is not the actual truth. So it's not afraid of bringing that back in, and the story that is currently suboptimal just further embedding the suboptimal story. It's not afraid of that happening anymore. Again, this is simplistic to say. It takes a lot of consistency and it takes a lot of work to be able to do this. It's not just like done in the click of a finger. However, that is essentially the process. So phase 2, this is cleaning up and growing up. So cleaning up is scrubbing off that dirt. That's the psychotherapeutic type of stuff. That's the real mucky, getting in there with the memories and really healing them, crying as many tears as is needed, doing the work. That's the real scrubbing process. Growing up refers to stages of consciousness. So stages of consciousness one can also see as sort of stages of cognitive maturity. And that's important also because at certain levels of cognitive development, one cannot make a coherent narrative out of a certain memory, depending on how intense or not it is. So growing up is really important, and there's lots of depth in that, but I'll just keep it simple for now. So um so this is where the trauma is cleaned off. This is where it's addressed and metabolized, um along with holistic lifestyle changes. So one's physical body revitalizes as well, and this allows the evolved psychological state to be embodied to a cellular level. The physical system doesn't feel like it's still in danger. So this is all of this overly sensitized nervous system, possibly a system that's shut down and is numb. The body itself being able to feel safe to feel again and be able to be in a parasympathetic rest and repair state. So this would be this would be a combination of the upper left and the upper right, and potentially the lower left quadrant as well with the relationship side of things. Um, Possibly the lower right environment quadrant as well, with choosing to be in a more sort of clean environment, less toxins, etc. I mean, I don't need to go into the details of that just now, but this is also the phase where the majority of the work is. So this is where pretty much all of the pain and the embodied kind of like sludge and toxicity is it's cleared from the system through psychological, energetic, and physical detoxification. So this is a really big phase, and this is where it's put into practice and applied. This is really where one does that cleaning work, and often for the first time they feel what it feels like to actually thrive or start feeling like they're thriving in life, because often people have had, just from childhood, it's been stress and unresolved trauma, and they've never actually fully experienced what it feels like to go through life feeling just filled up with joy and hope. uh but so it's not easy, this phase, but it is absolutely transformative. So this is where a lot of integral psychotherapy approaches and work comes in to clean the residue from the outer parts of the statue, cleaning the mud off. So there's different exercises for that, and again, it does get quite in depth and complex. So I'm not going to dive into that just right now. Self-articulation is evolved here. So how one speaks about oneself. In phase 1, self-perception was addressed and recalibrated and evolved. In phase two, that's anchored in through the conscious changing of how one speaks about oneself, and the actual vocal vibration of that new self-perception rattles and vibrates the physiology into a new alignment. That is the point of words and the power of words. They're vibratory. They create an alignment. Just how, like, if you put a vibration of a frequency on I can't remember the technical name of the plate, but you put sand on it and vibrate it at a certain frequency, the sand will configure in a geometric form. And also the work of Dr. Masaru Emoto, who showed the geometric shapes that frozen water crystals made in response to saying certain words to the water, is really prevalent here, because beautiful words created beautiful crystal shapes. Ugly words and just abuse and nastiness, the vibration that was coming from those words created really misshapen and ugly configurations. And as humans, we're 70% water. So what we say vocally, how we speak, configures our being. So that's really important. So self-articulation is so key to evolve here. And it's evolved to anchor in consciousness of the soul truth. And it's done so consciously, so that one's ego is not defined by foreign material that has been introjected from outside sources, essentially, be it the suboptimal abusive partner, the bully teacher at high school or secondary school, and the nasty things that some abusive parents may have said, etc. All of that is foreign material, but sometimes it gets in there so early it becomes what the ego believes its truth is. So self-articulation is changed there. In terms of the physiological side of things, this is also where Paul Chek's Dr. Quiet, Dr. Diet, and Dr. Movement come in to somatically clear and detox the psychic remnants from the body. This is also where adrenal fatigue is healed and addressed, and the nervous system is now taught physiologically and in an embodied way how to feel safe again. So the perception is I'm now safe because the trauma is being healed, and now physical behaviors are now calibrated to reflect that new perception. For example, how someone walks down the street, if they generally feel safe, is different to someone who feels like there's danger around every corner. Now, it's not to be naive and ignore danger, but it's also really important to know that in a traumatic state, people tend to get into a frame of mind where the world is inherently dangerous and there are only small pockets of safety that I can trust. Whereas the general truth is, when people are on the other side of trauma, is the world is generally pretty safe. But there are definite pockets and areas of danger and situations that can occur that we need to always be aware of and be able to set a boundary with. That's a fundamental difference in those two perceptions. But one causes stress because thinking that the whole world is just out to get me and dangerous and I can't be safe, so there's just no way of escaping being stressed, versus in general the world is pretty safe, but there are definite areas of danger and people and things and situations that I need to be aware of. So that's really important too. And building awareness of stages of consciousness development so that one transcends the stage of development that they were at when they could not process the trauma initially. And this is really important because, as Einstein said, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. So what this means in terms of growing up here is we can't create a coherent narrative out of a traumatic experience with the same level of thinking that interpreted what happened in the first place. We need a higher level of understanding and interpretation in order to be able to make sense of what happened. And that's what the growing up aspect is for. So finally, phase three, and I know we're whizzing through these, but like this whole process of going through these can be a long time. Like depending on what someone's dealing with, it can be a few years. It can be more, it could be less. It depends. I know for me personally, my own healing journey, I would say that mine, to get to the point where I'm at now, where I do very much feel like I'm on the other side of a lot of this, for me, putting my hand on my heart, it I would say it was 16 years for me. And for other people, it may be a lot less, because if you've got a lot of guidance and people who can support and really understand what's going on, you can shave like 7 years off of that easily. But just in my case, this was all very confusing to me, and it wasn't laid out like this, so I just had to try and piece it together myself, which definitely added a lot of time. However, culminating in phase three. So this is opening up and showing up. Opening up is opening oneself up to one's multiple intelligences. Essentially, what this means in terms of trauma is everybody has an inherent amount of genius in them that they're here to share. And sometimes when when the trauma is unresolved, their ego just currently hasn't allowed themselves to know that they have all of that genius inside of them that they have to share with the rest of the world. But now that that's been calibrated and evolved through the first two phases, now it's more accepting of like, oh, what is my genius? What do I want to share with the world now? So there are like multiple intelligences, can be cognitive, kinesthetic, tactile, artistic, musical, interpersonal, cognitive. There's so many different things. And showing up is then bringing those gifts to bear in their life and showing up in each of the four quadrants consciously and with health. So then what we have is a new balanced, harmonized life, a new harmonized life. So phase three, this is where one's new life is stepped into, being informed by their healed and integrating new life narrative and perception of what has happened. So the coherent narrative about what has happened has been made. The detoxification and clearing process has happened. The memories are still there, but they're not charged anymore. There's no disturbance there. And as a result, it has now informed their new life going forward. And then they're not, it's not still something that's unresolved. So this is a place for new healthy habits. This is a place for play. This is a place for fun, laughter, feeling life and the world, being able to feel the emotion of nature, to connect with nature, to enjoy all the beauty of the world, feeling every cell in one's body being enthusiastic for every moment in this precious life, and every day being seen as a deep and true blessing. Even what happened doesn't mean that we wish for it, but what it means is the wisdom that one now has as a result of the challenges that they went through, but were not defined by, has given them a certain wisdom that is allowing them to create an intensity of light and healing and joy and beauty for other people that is greater than the darkness that they went through. And that greater amount of light that they're now able to share as a result of what they went through, often helping other people address what they went through, is more light than the darkness they endured. And as a result, they are no longer tied to the darkness, because the light that they can create, the greater amount of light that they can create as a result of it, has allowed them to find meaning in what they went through. That is where trauma becomes transcendence, and that is where someone who was in a suboptimal state has now grown into greater resilience. That is the alchemical process. That's the phoenix being burnt down and rising again from the ashes. That's turning lead into gold. That is what the healing process is. And this is also where one's relationships, so both platonic and romantic, are redefined and engaged with in healthy ways. So as Dr. Keith Witt says, everything is relationships. The relationships of atoms to atoms, the relationship of people to people, people to environments, how everything in the four quadrants connect to each other. Everything is relationships. So, as Ken Wilber says, like, to deny relationships would essentially be playing checkers with ourselves. So platonic relationships and romantic relationships are really fundamental and really important. However, in this new phase, this new life that one brings themselves into as a result of this process, can now engage with both of those in a healthy way. Because when trauma is unresolved, a lot of the time the dynamics in relationships are more codependent. So there's usually an imbalance there. Oftentimes it was abusive in one direction. But now, because people are able to come into life and interact with life from a place of already being filled with enough love within themselves, they are now able to engage in co-creative friendships and co-creative romantic relationships. So if people are still in a relationship and they want to evolve it, then they stay in it, do the work together, and evolve it. If people are single and they want to get into a new relationship, then the way that they will choose partners is now different. What they look for is now different, because they're aware and have done all of this healing work. And also, this is where one's work and business are either evolved or replaced into something new that's deeply meaningful, that allows for just financial thriving and just being able to really love what they want to share with the world. So oftentimes people want to share what they've learned through their journey, and how that manifests will depend on what one's soul expression is. For me, it is in coaching here. For other people, it will be the same. For some other people, they may want to write books about it. Some people may want to create a company knitting jumpers or something that are really beautiful, or doing something with flowers or pottery, or um, creating online communities, or doing music that's informed by what they went through. Whatever it is, the point is, the wisdom they gain from the journey will come through in some kind of unique expression, but that often starts to tie into what they would like their work to be. And then so their day-to-day work and how they show up in the world has deep meaning to them. Combine that with a really strong and solid business structure that also allows them to give their gift and wisdom to the world, but at the same time have a really affluent financial and life, so they can thrive and travel and just experience life without the stress that they had before. Because finances and abundance is a reflection of one's belief in their own abundance and the ego, and just anchoring to the truth of the soul, which is we are abundant. Of course, there's four quadrants related to abundance, so a really good logical business structure is really important too. But that's another aspect to it. So this is where we've gone from right at the beginning, something's unresolved, right to new life where relationships are healed and they're now just thriving. So that's kind of like an overview. So now I'll just